The absolute weight of silence in a deeply fractured and unforgiving system. $5 million buys the briefcase. It also purchases ownership of your eternal soul. Refusal is not an option. Declining the offer simply guarantees the lights go out permanently. The delivery is precise and mechanical. Empathy was removed from the equation long ago. You accept the heavy burden. The transaction concludes without a single whispered word between shadows. The digital compass provides the destination. A one-way ticket directly into the barren, unforgiving wasteland. The messenger disappears into the void. Your isolated operational phase officially begins right now. The heavy engine roars to life. It drowns out the deafening silence of a compromised conscience. Forward momentum is the only protocol. Looking back invites sudden and catastrophic structural failure. Leaving the subterranean shadows behind, the harsh daylight offers absolutely no forgiveness or redemption. The metropolis fades into a distant memory. Only the critical mission parameters remain strictly active. The coordinates pull you relentlessly forward, a technological leash dragging you toward the absolute inevitable. The cracked asphalt stretches endlessly ahead, a dark corridor leading directly into the burning inferno. The perimeter is strictly guarded. Static figures ensure the designated pathway remains entirely clear. The environment is inherently hostile. The dry earth silently consumes all historical evidence of conflict. A silent authorization code is instantly transmitted. The final heavily restricted gate violently swings open. The silent watchers observe the descent. They are the ultimate witnesses to the impending burial. The physical pressure continuously mounts. The required psychological detachment becomes increasingly difficult to actively maintain. The path is intentionally obscured. A heavy veil of dust permanently hides the incoming executioner. The final destination is successfully reached. Ground zero for the permanent neutralization of undeniable truth. The severe heat acts as an immediate physical assault. The barren landscape offers absolutely zero shelter or unwanted witnesses. Mechanical beasts stand permanently ready to consume the evidence. Their metallic roars easily drown out any remaining operational conscience. The dry earth is forcibly opened, a temporary structural wound aggressively preparing to permanently swallow a heavily compromised payload. The primary transaction asset remains securely anchored to your side. A heavy, physical reminder of the impending eternal silence. The contracted operators function purely on instinct and payload delivery. Moral implications were entirely excluded from their original blueprints. The final metallic vessel awaits its rapid descent. Inside, the compromised cargo remains permanently offline and completely motionless forever. The final authorization protocol is officially initiated. The irreversible process of deep structural concealment aggressively begins right here. The heavy machinery blindly obeys the given command. The severe lifting process requires absolutely zero human empathy or hesitation. The immense physical tension is purely mechanical. The rusted chains easily bear the incredible weight of a dozen erased histories. The dark metallic vault hangs completely suspended in the arid atmosphere. A brief, highly calculated display before the ultimate descent. The heavy shadow of consequence briefly covers your operational path. You simply stand your ground and fully accept the darkness. The operational timeline remains aggressively strict. Severe delays in the pouring phase inevitably lead to highly fatal structural complications later. The cold remnants are finally lowered directly into the earth. The irreversible descent toward a permanent, entirely untraceable structural zero. The sheer kinetic impact entirely seals the deal. The static figures have officially reached their final designated operational coordinates forever. The heavy mechanical deployment phase concludes without any critical errors. The immediate transition into the permanent sealing protocol is officially authorized. The massive liquid tomb begins its extremely slow rotation, actively preparing to completely fill the deep void with cold, unforgiving permanence. The heavy mechanical floodgates are violently thrown wide open. The absolute, permanent erasure of history is practically entirely guaranteed right now. The gray wave completely buries the absolute truth. A heavy, highly suffocating blanket effectively silencing all remaining operational anomalies forever. The immediate visual evidence is rapidly disappearing from direct sight. A perfect, incredibly seamless transition back into completely unrecorded static noise. The physical seal is utterly flawless and permanently unforgiving. The dark secrets are officially, entirely removed from the active operational board. The gray tide aggressively consumes everything. A heavy, permanent blanket, completely neutralizing all previous operational errors forever. The industrial machinery demands absolute precision. Any structural hesitation easily compromises the entire deep concealment protocol. The dark vault goes permanently offline, a highly flawless transition back into pure, unrecorded geographical static. The mechanical beast powers down completely. Its brutal operational mandate successfully executed without any critical system failures. The physical remnants deeply stain the skin, an incredibly dark reality, actively replacing former artistic precision forever. These hands previously orchestrated complex melodies. Now they strictly facilitate the permanent burial of highly compromised secrets. The artistic soul rapidly solidifies, hardening entirely into an incredibly rigid, heavily compromised internal structural foundation forever. The internal empathy is totally neutralized, the psychological parameters successfully adjusted to completely ignore extreme collateral damage. The structural void is officially filled. The heavy industrial floodgates violently slam shut on the absolute truth. The violent mechanical churning finally ceases, leaving behind an incredibly flat, highly deceptive layer of newly established terrain. The heavy gray seal rapidly cures, actively locking the completely silent static figures into their permanent structural coordinates. The heavy physical labor actively numbs the mind, a highly necessary distraction from the entirely unavoidable psychological erosion. The final cosmetic adjustments aggressively begin, actively camouflaging the highly intrusive structural anomaly from unauthorized aerial reconnaissance surveillance. The surrounding landscape reclaims the isolated zone. The heavy artificial scar rapidly vanishes entirely into the natural desolate background. The heavy physical tools completely finish the contract, effectively erasing all remaining kinetic tracks from the active operational grid. The highly toxic environment violently bleeds into you, the absolute physical corruption aggressively mirroring the deeply compromised internal state. The independent contractors silently disengage, their highly specific operational mandates fully executed without a single unnecessary verbal exchange. The heavy logistical footprints are rapidly secured. Complete environmental reset is actively initiated to heavily confuse pursuing hostile elements. The massive financial compensation is thoroughly verified. The incredibly heavy price tag heavily affixed to a completely extinguished conscience. The massive transaction is completely sealed. The highly sensitive cargo successfully buried alongside your completely neutralized human empathy forever. The physical surface completely solidifies. Simultaneously, the internal moral compass entirely shatters into absolute nothingness forever. Unseen static figures continuously observe the perimeter. Absolute paranoia becomes the standard operational baseline permanently now. The artificial terrain aggressively mimics nature. A perfect camouflage, actively hiding highly classified structural anomalies forever. The heavy physical tools are decisively discarded. The primary burial protocol is officially and entirely concluded. The heavy metallic asset remains safely secured, a massive financial weight effectively replacing standard human empathy. The unseen architects demand absolute silence. They actively finance the permanent removal of highly unwanted variables. $5 million completely buys the silence. A heavy transaction aggressively sealing highly compromised lips forever. The encrypted digital tether remains highly active, constantly awaiting the absolute next set of operational instructions. The contracted mechanical support aggressively disperses, effectively leaving you entirely alone with the incredibly heavy silence. Total psychological exhaustion rapidly sets in. The absolute emptiness aggressively fills the deeply compromised internal void. The solar cycle violently concludes, aggressively pulling a heavy dark veil over the entire operational theater. The heavy logistical traces entirely evaporate, successfully vanishing into the completely unrecorded geographical static, completely undetected. Mechanical power aggressively initiates the extraction. The heavily armored transport prepares to quickly abandon the zone. Forward momentum aggressively resumes. Looking directly backward remains a strictly forbidden, highly dangerous operational hazard permanently. The harsh environment actively cleanses the path, rapidly erasing all undeniable evidence of the heavy incursion. The return trajectory is purely automatic. The internal pilot is permanently offline, replaced by mechanical routine. The secure channel violently activates, a heavily scrambled frequency aggressively piercing the absolute, deeply heavy silence. The digital handshake is fully completed. The deeply compromised operative stands permanently by for new instructions. A completely new set of parameters drops. The violent cycle of absolute silence aggressively restarts immediately. The dark machine accelerates into the void, actively chasing the next highly lucrative, deeply tragic erasure. The absolute darkness entirely consumes the physical path. A heavy, highly suffocating void completely mirroring your internal state. The mechanical gauges continuously monitor external physical conditions. Internal psychological metrics remain permanently offline and deeply compromised. Time entirely loses its standard operational meaning. Each passing second heavily adds to the incredibly dense internal weight. The remote architects constantly verify the current trajectory. Complete operational control remains firmly in their highly sterile hands. The heavy financial asset travels completely silently. A deeply dense payload, actively anchoring your entirely compromised existence forever. The desolate mechanical infrastructure aggressively welcomes the returning asset. A deeply broken environment, completely suited for highly broken tools. The secondary operational safehouse is rapidly approached. A highly fortified, deeply isolated structure perfectly designed for absolute concealment. Mechanical power is instantly and completely severed. The totally deafening, highly oppressive silence violently reclaims the immediate physical space. The heavily stressed mechanical components aggressively cool down. A deeply temporary physical rest before the inevitable next heavy deployment. The physical transaction payload must be entirely secured. The highly dangerous liability constantly demands absolute physical possession immediately. The deeply isolated safe point is physically breached. Total architectural security completely guarantees absolute isolation from unwanted hostile elements. Every single physical step is totally measured. The deeply structured operational routine completely prevents any highly fatal psychological collapse. The highly secure storage vault awaits the final deposit, a heavily fortified structure actively protecting entirely unrecorded dark histories. The mechanical physical locks heavily disengage completely, accessing the deeply hidden, completely isolated internal storage core successfully now. The heavy structural barrier perfectly opens entirely, actively revealing a deeply organized, completely terrifying archive of highly permanent silences. The massive financial weight is officially deposited, successfully transferred from highly dangerous active status into completely static deep storage. The heavy structural seal completely locks into place. The highly sensitive, deeply dark liability is totally removed from play. The physical mission parameters are totally fulfilled, leaving behind absolutely nothing except an incredibly heavy, completely empty internal void. The harsh chemical agent aggressively burns the throat, a completely futile, highly temporary attempt to effectively erase the stains. The artistic hands are totally ruined forever, completely replaced by heavily calloused tools designed exclusively for deeply tragic erasures. Complete physical isolation is practically guaranteed. The heavy psychological void violently expands within the dark architecture entirely. Removing the heavily compromised outer layer completely fails to cleanse the deeply permanent internal structural stains entirely. The violent physical evidence physically sheds. However, the heavy psychological toll actively remains completely anchored forever entirely. The mechanical cleansing ritual aggressively begins, desperately attempting to wash away entirely unforgiving, highly permanent consequences physically. The thick chemical residue actively resists removal, a highly stubborn reminder of the deeply compromised static payload. The fractured reflection confirms the total transformation. The original empathetic blueprint is officially permanently offline completely now. Relics of a highly peaceful, entirely forgotten past remain, actively mocking the deeply corrupted present operational reality completely. The deeply mechanical enforcer actively confronts the buried artist. A highly violent, completely silent internal structural clash entirely, exposing the highly delicate, completely fragile internal core. A deeply dangerous emotional hazard, heavily avoided until now exactly. The heavily compromised tools violently refuse the artistic command. They only strictly understand deeply permanent erasures completely now. The highly complex melodies are permanently silenced, completely replaced by the totally deafening roar of heavy machinery entirely. The fragile internal doorway violently closes, fully accepting the incredibly heavy, deeply permanent mechanical underworld protocol forever. Nostalgia represents a highly fatal operational error. Forward momentum remains the absolute, strictly enforced survival protocol permanently now. The highly secure digital tether violently activates again. The incredibly brief operational rest period is officially terminated entirely. A completely new geographical location actively renders. Another highly lucrative, completely tragic payload aggressively requires immediate processing entirely. Exhaustion is actively overridden by absolute protocol. The mechanical system automatically reboots for highly extreme operational deployment perfectly. The highly heavy metallic vault completely closes again. The deeply isolating operational environment aggressively embraces its pilot completely. The heavy industrial beast violently awakens, actively roaring against the incredibly deep, highly suffocating silence of midnight completely. The mechanical illumination aggressively pierces the void, actively hunting for the entirely new, highly classified geographical objective ahead. The heavily compromised cycle violently restarts entirely. Tomorrow mathematically guarantees another entirely tragic, completely permanent structural concealment perfectly. The endless cycle brutally resets itself. A heavy, highly suffocating void, completely mirroring your entirely broken internal state. The digital coordinates demand immediate absolute compliance. The highly broken system strictly forbids any form of internal reflection. The encrypted path rapidly solidifies. Every single calculated mile heavily adds to the incredibly dense psychological weight. The concrete jungle perfectly hides the darkest transactions. The heavily shadowed infrastructure actively welcomes the returning asset. The unseen architects position their physical proxies flawlessly. They actively finance the permanent removal of highly unwanted variables. Forward momentum aggressively halts. The heavily armored transport perfectly aligns for the absolute next physical payload exchange. The violent weather actively assists the concealment, nature itself aggressively washing away the undeniable evidence of the exchange. The deeply isolated physical exchange zone is breached. Total architectural security completely guarantees absolute isolation from unwanted elements. The absolute burden is physically transferred again. A completely identical payload, carrying an entirely new, highly permanent tragedy. The massive financial weight is officially accepted, successfully transferring a highly dangerous liability directly into your physical possession. The transaction proxy rapidly disappears into the void, leaving you entirely alone with the incredibly heavy, dark silence. The heavy metallic asset is safely secured, a massive financial weight effectively replacing standard human empathy once more. The physical surface remains completely unyielding, actively locking the deeply compromised dark secrets entirely away from the world. The heavily isolating operational environment aggressively embraces its pilot. The internal pilot is permanently offline, completely replaced by mechanics. The ultimate destination perfectly solidifies, a completely final set of parameters dropping directly into the active operational matrix. Mechanical power aggressively initiates the extraction. The heavily armored transport violently abandons the deeply compromised urban exchange zone. The heavy industrial beast violently awakens again, actively roaring against the incredibly deep, highly suffocating silence of the storm. The desolate mechanical infrastructure aggressively fades away, a completely broken environment entirely surrendering to the highly absolute dark wasteland. The harsh environment actively cleanses the physical path, rapidly erasing all undeniable evidence of the highly classified heavy incursion. Exhaustion is actively overridden by absolute protocol. Forward momentum remains the entirely strictly enforced survival mandate, permanently now. The violent atmospheric conditions aggressively mask the heavily classified approach. Nature strictly enforces absolute operational security tonight. The mechanical beast violently stops. The newly designated geographical coordinates are officially reached in total, absolute darkness. The highly encrypted tether officially confirms the drop zone. The deeply endless cycle of structural concealment brutally resumes. The compromised operative directly confronts the harsh elements again. The heavy financial payload demands immediate physical processing. The highly primitive mechanical tool is aggressively deployed once more, a physical instrument designed strictly for silent erasures. The violent physical excavation aggressively restarts, actively carving another completely empty void directly into the desolate terrain. The dry earth actively resists the highly intrusive mechanical violation. However, the heavily compromised protocol always wins. The heavy physical camouflage is actively applied, violently erasing the undeniable structural truth from the active operational grid. The absolute physical toll violently mounts. The heavily compromised biological machine actively approaches highly critical system failure. The toxic environment violently bleeds directly into the operator, a perfectly dark reflection of the heavily compromised interior. The geographical surface perfectly resets itself, actively absorbing another completely silent tragedy directly into the entirely desolate void. The newly established terrain perfectly successfully hides the payload. The highly strict burial parameter is absolutely fulfilled forever. The physical labor aggressively concludes, leaving absolutely nothing behind completely except entirely heavy, intensely dense, dark silence. The heavy financial weight actively replaces the entirely eradicated internal conscience, a deeply permanent, highly tragic structural exchange. The physical exterior strictly seals the highly compromised dark truth forever, a perfectly unyielding vault for deeply tragic erasures. Tomorrow mathematically guarantees another entirely tragic operational concealment. The highly compromised dark underworld cycle remains absolutely, completely unbreakable. Total isolation aggressively crushes the entirely broken internal core. The deeply compromised mechanical enforcer completely accepts the heavy silence. Mechanical power aggressively initiates the highly necessary departure. The entirely broken transport violently prepares to totally abandon the grid. The violent atmospheric conditions successfully erase all highly undeniable physical footprints immediately. Nature actively conceals the highly classified operation. The dark cycle is permanent. Subscribe to completely ensure your highly secure operational survival in the deeply fractured system.